Greetings viewers, EricTheCarGuy back with part 2 of the engine compartment and interior modifications on hashtag ETCG Dad's Truck. I almost forgot what I was working on there for a second. I will put a link in the description to part 1. Actually, all of ETCG Dad's Truck videos are episodic. They're all numbered. You can find out what number episode you're on down in the description, and you can find the last video that was produced and the next video if there is one available. Also, there are extended versions of these videos available to premium members on my website, also linked down in the description. But I'm done telling you about all that stuff, so you just want to see what happens with the truck to get it up and running. Well, let's get to that right now. Obviously, this is the dash, and I've decided that I'm going to put my cooling fan switch right here, and I'm going to put my exhaust cutout switch right here. This is what I'm going to use for a cooling fan switch. You might have seen previously I wired, at least ran one of the wires there. I got this bag of switches, which is fun. There are 3 different colors I can choose from. Ooh, wait a minute, there are 4 different colors. Blue! I have blue! I'm using blue. Blue for cooling fan, right? Anyway, lighted switches. I have 4 different colors here, but I'm going to take this switch, put it in here for cooling fans. And in this box, we have my new exhaust cutout. It has, I'm sure, some wiring. Yes, look, there's wires. And this motor that's got to go down on the exhaust, but we're not there yet. Anyway, all the bits are here. Here's the wire. Here is the switch, which is what I intend to install up here. And try to get as much of this wiring down in there as I can, which this looks strange. We'll have to figure that out. Ooh, giant shrink. Ooh, Summit shrink tube. Wow, that's fancy. 2 of them. And I've discovered that this switch is set up so that you can run 2 of these if you want. Since I only have single exhaust coming out of the engine, I only need to run 1. But since I'm only running 1 of these can go in my pile of connectors to use. So they don't need to be around. And all I really need to do, I mean, it doesn't get more simple than this. There's already an inline fuse. This is going to get 12 volt switched ignition hot, and this is going to get a ground. Already my clutch slave cylinder hole is coming in handy. We're running wires through it. Oh, we were running wires through it. We plan to run wires through it right now, because eventually we'll need to hook up to this. Look at where my wire comes out, like right there. I am liking this a lot. All right, well, that part of it's solved. So I'm gonna work on putting that switch in that dash panel. I'm gonna start with this one. I believe the hole that I need to drill is 19 millimeters. That says 20. So if I drill at 19, I'll be good, right? All right, almost to the end, it looks like. And that's the thing about these round switches, is you gotta get the hole just the right size or it'll be a problem. I'm using the X method to find the center. So I'm going corner to corner, corner to corner, and that's the middle, or roughly. I'm gonna do the same thing here because I'm also gonna be drilling a hole for the other switch. And I'll just make the actual marks in the middle, and the part that is gonna go away when I cut it. And I'm staying off the edge here on account of this has got a little bit of thickness to it. That hole goes there, that hole goes there. Close enough for Dad's truck. All right, we need to take this one all the way down to the 13/16. I'm just gonna recheck that. I'm glad I double checked because I just noticed something. See that little ridge right there? Well, I didn't notice that when I was clamping down, and that accounted for that extra millimeter, so I just hold it slightly offset. And I do get a 19 millimeter as far as the size. Had I went all the way to that step when I went too far. So 19 is really close to 3/4. This is the 3/4 mark on the drill bit. With step bits, you kind of have to do this. So you go through the one way and then you go through the other side. Do it again. Try to sneak up on it. If you go too far, well, then it's game over. Still needs a little more, but I'm not going to use the drill. I'm going to get my rat tail file and file this out until I get to the proper size. Nice. Takes a bit of resistance to get it to come out, and if I really need it to stay in there, I can always glue it. Okay, this one's a little more straightforward. I save the washer for the outside. And you know, you could set the depth of this. So if you don't want this sticking out a bunch, you can have it set up the way you want it. So it doesn't have to be like sticking out of the dash. It can be, but it looks like on is to the right. I like that. On to the right. On to the right. Let's switch it to inches this time, find out what. I'm gonna do it like this so I don't wind up in one of the threads. About 1/2 inch. And this doesn't matter if it gets drilled a little big. You know, it's got this washer and this nut on the back, so you're in a safe zone there, but it looks like this goes to 1/2 inch. We're like 3rd down for 1/2 inch. Nice, snug fit. I like it. Open, closed. Very pleased about this. I should just run this in by a couple of screws or something, because it's being annoying.
I will be covering the installation of the radio and speakers in another video.
Just gonna put this upper dash piece in place. I really don't need to take it out again, and it's gonna be a lot easier to mock things up if this radio stays put. Just try to think things through. It gets harder the longer you go on. I'll share that with you. Yeah, motivation begins to wane as, you know, you're starting to take every last part of the vehicle, whatever you're modifying. It doesn't necessarily have to be a truck like this, but whatever you're modifying, it just gets to a point where you're like, geez, how much more stuff do I have to take apart before I can put it back together? All my wiring is gonna come up through here. Same place as the fog light switch, but I'm probably gonna have to power up the system so I can check the fuse box and find out what I have for ignition hot, because both these switches are gonna need power. And really, I think that's, well, for the one, the power is for the control box. So for the exhaust cutouts, control box. But the only reason this other switch needs power is to power that light. I'm switching a ground, so, you know, I can find a ground anywhere. Look, there's one. Any place metal is pretty much a ground. Having the HVAC in here will also allow me to test compressor and stuff, because I can bypass the pressure switch and make sure that that's still working. Well, doesn't look like they're gonna make it perfect, but that's got nothing to do with me. Right is on. I could even get a little something, put it over there, or draw on. Or this will just be the secret thing. Like somebody will get in here, doesn't know the truck, and be like, what's this for? Oh no, it's all loud and broken. It just looks like I'm going to be feeding the switch up through this hole, because this doesn't look like it's going to be large enough. I have to consider this carefully, because I still have gauges and everything else to wire up, and it's not like I can disconnect and reconnect these connectors for the switch, at least not in its present configuration. But if I take these off and use the spade connectors that they gave me, I can do exactly that, and therefore I can keep this separate, and whenever I remove this, I won't have to remove that switch. Let's go do that now. That's a better design. I almost wish they hadn't done this, meaning wired it up previously, because anybody else who's going to do this is going to run into the same problem. So once you've got the switch in, it's in, and yeah, it's connected. Well, it's connected to all this, so it's not like you can take a piece of the dash out like this and put it back in. Oh, there's little remnants here. Yeah, white, black, red. Well, that's kind of done. We just need to wire this thing up inside. Just need power and a ground. So why am I installing the steering wheel? In order for me to find an ignition hot source to run actually both my switches, I kind of want to run the cooling fans off of hot all the time. And if you leave them on, you'll know, because they make a lot of noise. But I want to get everything plugged in so I can get my powers out of the fuse box, and I'll need one that's ignition hot. And the only way to determine that is to plug in the ignition. And I've already got the battery and everything set up outside, so that once I do make this determination, I can move forward. And in a way, having this in here also makes it so that I can help route my wires and everything. Very important with the testing of these circuits, I don't want the computer to power up for the first time until I'm ready for it to power up for the first time, because there's a pairing sequence that you have to go through. So I've unplugged it. And I've basically moved my battery setup, which I had on the floor, to up here. Same thing, main power lead going to the power distribution, and I just took a jumper cable and hooked it up to the body ground up underneath the heater hose there. I hook this up, and we should be ready for testing. If I see dome lights. I've also got my trusty power probe hooked up to the battery so I can test circuits.
There are a few pins inside the fuse box. That one's powered on now. That one's ground. Ground. So this one down here, that might be my candidate for the cooling fan. And then this other one up here that's ground to start with. Let's turn the ignition on and see if that goes hot. If it does, that's my boy. Nope. Oh, this top one's ground too. Okay, it's always hot. That's my boy.
We finally solved this problem, which I'm happy about. But I've run into another one when I went to do the wiring. When I started thinking it through, I thought, what I've done with the relays is I've made them ground side switched. This switch that I've installed, these 3-pole switches, so you've got both of these silver terminals are going to be what is switched. And they will be power. Both of these will be power. And this other brass-looking terminal goes to ground. So whenever you activate the switch, it allows the power to pass through it, and because it's got a ground here, the light on the front will activate. So your LED turns on as you activate the switch. Because I'm on a ground side, however, and I'm ground side switching, so in other words, I'm hooking up a ground here and I'm hooking up a path to ground here, and then I'm hooking up the ground for my fans here. When I close the switch, there's no power available to light the light. And you can't run power into this terminal, in other words, use the switch backwards from what it's normally used, because it simply will not work. I'm going to still be able to use this switch, and I'll close it, and the fans will turn on. In fact, I can demonstrate on the car now. If I ground the wire inside the dash, you can hear the relays clicking. That works as intended. But I won't have a lighted switch, so I'm going to have to write something on here like on, off, cooling fan, whatever. I don't know what I'm going to have to do in order to make this work. But I'm not going to be able to use the light. I found the radio head unit used to be attached down here to this little tab. I'm going to use this as my ground. It's metal, and I know it attaches to the body of the truck. So I'm going to use this for the ground for both switches. So it's going to be the ground for my switch for my relays. It's also going to be the ground for my exhaust cutout. And then all I'll have to do is run the power for the exhaust cutout down from the control unit, whatever it is, over to the inside of this convenience center where I found the switched ignition hot. Since I'm here, I'm just going to take the cooling fan wire up over stuff and then down into that opening. What is it about drop lights that never want to go, ow, where you tell them to? See what kind of guy I am? I don't even need eyes. Somehow that worked. Okay, ground for cooling fans. In fact, with what I have left over, I can probably just run that down to there. Speaking of which, I'm going to find myself an appropriate size fastener and get that in there. Perfect. Here is the wiring for all of that stuff that we were stressing about. And I can zip tie this up inside here and get this one set up to where I can also take this and run it down here. In fact, both of these can use the same ground. Then all I've got to do is sort out the power. Find a suitable eyelet. I call these stabby washers so that it can have a little bite into the metal. But this is going to be my ground for a lot of stuff. I'm going to have to also ground the gauges. This is going to come in handy. Now let's find suitable power wire. I'm really glad that that flipped over and is now shining directly in my face, because that's what a light should do. A light should make it so that it gives you the illusion of helping, but it's not. I'm helping. I like to go up above as much stuff as I possibly can when running wires. Nothing I hate more than like driving down the road and then you've got to deal with wires dangling around your feet, getting tangled up and stuff. This is the wire that goes down to the actual exhaust cutout that needs to plug into one of these pigtails that's hanging around here somewhere. There it is. It needs to plug into this. I'm going to put the end on that goes into the fuse box over there, and then I'm going to come over here, cut this to length. I'm just going to plug this in now so I can check my length. We should be able to plug in the exhaust cutout and activate it with the ignition on. Once we plug this in, of course. Did you forget what colors go where? It's okay, on account of there's still remnants of the old wires left, enough of them to wear. I can actually figure that out. Now let's go plug in the cutout. Got to put this in such a way to where when it opens, it's going to have room to grow. Connect the ground. Ignition on. And activate. And activate. And activate. And activate. Turn the key all the way, Eric. That's how it's done. And activate. And activate. I hear clicking. Where? That's a mystery. I'm not happy. I've got a bad one of these. How do I know I have a bad one of these? Well, first of all, it doesn't work when I activate the switch. So I'm checking the circuit all the way to the point where it plugs in. So all the way to this point where this plugs in. So I can turn the ignition on. I can take my power probe. Now there's two things inside of this ring. There's the outer ring and the inner ring. And depending upon whether it's opening or closing, one will turn to power and one will turn to ground for a predetermined amount of time based on what this little timer here says. This sends a signal into this box sends power and ground down to this connector, which in turn opens and closes that. So I'm not sure which direction I'm in now because it'll only go one way or the other. But so I've got, if I go on the inside of this, I've got ground on the outside and ground on that middle part, the way it sits now. So nothing's happening. I hit the switch so that I can actually hear, you hear this click and activate when it's working properly. Oops. Didn't quite catch it that time. And then it turns off, and then you go the other way, and then the middle one will be the power. So this is sending power, and this has ground here too. I'll show you that it's got both power and ground. So it has everything it needs to work, but it's not working. I've even gone so far as to go directly to this connector and trying both ways. So I tried this outer sheath here as if it were ground, and just touching this, I'm not even seeing a ground. I'm not even seeing a full connection. So there's an open inside this motor, because anytime I've done this, I usually see, oh, okay, there's a connection there. So it shows that there's a loop, but there isn't here. There's no connection inside this motor. I'm faced with the dilemma. I either opt for another one of these altogether, but I've already sort of committed with the switch and everything. I wonder if I were able to clip this wire, if there's just a power and a ground in here. If there is, whatever one of these I get, these are just simple motors. Whatever one of these I get, I can use all this wiring and everything down to this point, and the whole momentary thing, which I think is cool. I don't have that on the Fairmont, and I kind of wish I did. I hold it to open and I hold it to close, and when it's closed, I'm this guy right here. I'm this little black box when I do mine. What I'm going to do, since we've got all this hooked up, is we're so close to hooking up the other switch. Why don't we hook the other switch up and see if when we activate that the relays out on the fender there click. Okay, let's just get our other switch hooked up and verify that operation. Today's lesson, viewers, buy lots of connectors. You will sacrifice a few. And a lot of it has to do with tools, whether or not they function correctly or want to let you down or whatever. These are the leads that are going to head right down directly to the cooling fans, and they're off now. Switch is also off, so that's encouraging. Now that they're on, or now that the switch is on, I should see power here. I'm seeing nothing. Oh, I know why. Silly me. Okay, it's a relay, right? So you can't just power up the coil. If you want to see what the coil is powering up, you also have to plug that in too. Well, right here is the power side, and it is far from plugged in. So let me strip a little bit of this wire, hook this up to battery positive, and we should see a result. All right, so it's going to work just the opposite, because if the switch is turned on now, which I think it is. All right, so we've got nothing at the moment. Okay, so the switch works just the opposite of how you think it would. And it looks like the way things are wired now, I can leave the cooling fans on even with the ignition out, if I wanted to, even with the ignition off. So I have to be careful. Those fans are loud. You will know if they're on. Let's move on. Welcome back. For you, it's only been a couple of seconds. For me, maybe it was days, not sure. Remember we needed our fuel pump fuse to supply power? Well, they're in. And no, I'm not just done. It's very fashionable to wear 30 amp fuses. This is a 30 amp fuse. And I'm just going to cut and trim it to fit and stick it up over on there. Stick it over on, anyway, you know what I mean. I'm gonna put this on there so fuel pump can have power. There's a bee over here. He's just kind of hanging out. I don't know what he's doing. He seems to like my electrical connectors. Anyway, we need one connection to the firewall. That feels like a reasonable distance. Really, on the big ones too? Someday I'm gonna learn the secret handshake of this. Let's try another. That didn't feel like it did much. I feel like it feels like it did too much. It's not going anywhere though, and once I melt it, you will never know. Well, you'll know, you just saw me do it on camera. I'm gonna go for a little bitey washer down on there to make a nice clean connection. Greetings viewers, EricTheCarGuy. Back working on the truck, but I did a few things off camera that I want to share with you before we get started today. Mainly I worked on the wiring harness inside the engine compartment here. I took all the tape away and I replaced it with zip ties. I think this is a much better way to go about building your own wiring harness because you're able to move the wires inside the zip ties, unlike you would be with the tape. I did this with the Fairmont, it actually worked a lot better. I'm really kind of questioning why I didn't do it this time, but whatever. I also added a couple of new ground straps, and I've got something else to show you as well. I got a working exhaust cutout now. So I exchanged this one with Summit and plugged it in, and that's all I had to do was plug it in. And now, a little disappointed it doesn't open all the way though. I like that it opens on its own, but it doesn't seem to open all the way. It gets better the more you use it, I guess. Anyway, exhaust cutout works now. One other thing I did was I ordered a different switch that is not lighted, that is clearly marked on and off for the cooling fans, and it does work. You can hear things click under the hood. And it's clearly marked on and off, so I'm going to go with this instead of that lighted switch. Problem solved. Welcome back, viewers. I've been a busy boy since you've been gone, and I'm kind of glad I had the time. Sometimes it's nice just to work, not have cameras on, and just get stuff done, because there's a lot to do in a short amount of time. This is what I've done. I've gone back through the wiring harness. I think I've already mentioned that I've switched things over to zip ties, but you may also notice that I have the fuel pressure regulator installed with the fuel pressure gauge. I've also routed the fuel line going up to it, which would be the return line that's down underneath it. I also dropped the fuel tank and installed the new fuel pump and found the wires for the fuel gauge sending unit and ran those up into the dash so that I can easily access them. I also went ahead and just threw a coat of paint on these hinges. That was with a piece of cardboard behind it. It worked. Let's go inside the truck. You might notice this shiny new B&M shifter, which is also sitting up a couple of inches higher. I found out the adjustability of the height with these things is actually done in those lower mounts. When I took it off, they were slotted so you could move it up or down. I moved it up as far as I could with the cable being the way it was. It now works as intended, and the indicator and everything works like it should. Be able to ratchet down, ratchet back up. And then it also has illumination hooked up or ready to be hooked up. This is the wire going down to the illumination inside of here. I was also able to hook up the backup light switch inside of this. So the backup light switch is going to go through the shifter and not necessarily through the transmission. I put the interior back together for the most part. So it's virtually together, all the stuff in the back here and then the carpet. You know, I thought about cleaning the carpet and doing something like that, but given that I want to remove the carpet and put down more of that Eastwood X-Mat stuff, the same stuff that I put up under the headliner, I figure I'll do that all at once when I just get a new piece of carpet, because the hole that's cut over here, well, it was never quite right. So it would be nice to have a new piece of carpet so that I could really clean up the interior. Remember the speaker covers that broke when I removed them? I put some epoxy in here. Seems to be fastened down all right. I haven't installed these quite yet. There's some things that I may run down through this area before I install them. This is a big one and kind of a huge win, not just in the sense that this is probably the largest radiator you can stuff in a GMT 400, but this took a bit of fiddling and figuring out to make all this work. But this is the front clip on the truck that's sitting here on the bench, and this is mounted where it's going to be when it's on the truck. So this is a Be Cool radiator that I got from Summit. Like I said, it's pretty much freaking massive. It might have been for diesel applications or whatever, but it does fit. There were some modifications that I had to do, as I mentioned. One of those modifications was on this lower mount. Okay, so this lower mount on what would be the passenger side needed the most modification. Not only, it used to sit in here. So the old radiator used to mount and sit in this area, and it's been extended out like, what, 2 or 3 inches in both directions actually. So I had to not only trim this because it was too wide, but it was also too tall and causing this whole side of the radiator to sit up high. So I trimmed it lengthwise as well as side to side so I could get it up in there. This side over here went right in, but I also, this lip sticks over on the end here, so I cut a little bit off the bottom, push this in so the lip would fit over the outside. Then came the challenge of mounting the cooling fans, which, as you can see, it's smaller than the radiator. I'm okay with it. I'm going to roll with it. This is a massive radiator. I know it's going to move a lot of heat. So this to me is extra. So even though this part over here isn't shrouded, if you looked on the other side, it's almost blocked off anyway. So anyway, I'm not going to justify it. I'm just going to leave this on here like now. If there are cooling system problems, I'll extend this out to the edge. I don't suspect there will be, because we have 4,000 CFM worth of air movement here from these Spall fans in this Duraley setup. Getting this centered up, there was some modifications I needed to do to these lower mounts in particular to try to get all this stuff in here. Also, I sort of makeshift welded some stuff to make it so that I could remove the lower fasteners down here, and then I came up with some spacers that also work. But the trickiest thing that I did out of all of this, which you may or may not have noticed, this here is the old fan shroud. So the old fan used to spin in here, but it also held the radiator in place on top of that core support. If you'll notice, I cut some pieces out and I've gone through and added them as my hold downs for the radiator assembly. So those are all trimmed down and they work. This is not going anywhere. Still using the same rubber mounts. I kind of like that this is also plastic and flexible. You don't want to hard mount these kind of items because vibrations can damage them. So these things will be insulated from vibrations and everything is good to go. Went back through the parts for the Fairmont and happened to find this, which did not work out on the Fairmont, but it's going to be the upper radiator hose for this radiator, which is kind of awesome. But in addition to the radiator, I had to purchase separately this fitting right here so that I could run the heater hose into the radiator. The radiator already had provisions to put this in, thankfully, because the heater hose did run in, one of them, the return, did run directly into the radiator like this does, and now I have this fitting. I have a similar fitting just like this for the water pump also, because they used to take coolant off the back of the intake manifold, which is no longer an option. So now there's a place on the water pump that it's going to come off and feed the heater core from. I'm not done here yet, because in addition to the radiator and everything, there's one more cooler that I need. You may have noticed that there's no transmission cooler in this radiator. It is made for a manual transmission, so I have to run a separate power steering cooler, which could be this one here, or not power steering cooler, I'm sorry, transmission cooler. That could be this one here, but the transmission should arrive later today, and it is also supposed to come with a transmission cooler, so I'm going to look at the two and decide which one works best and figure out how to mount that to the front. The challenge with this is the only area I have to pass through is right here. So going through in front of the radiator, this will already be taken up by two AC lines that are going to the condenser in front of all this. In addition to all that stuff, I have prepped things out for the installation of the gauges, which did arrive recently. They're over here. That's going to be covered in another video. I'm making a separate video on making your own instrument cluster and gauges and those types of things. However, one thing I did have to do, which during my testing I found out that what the headlight switch screws into is pretty much junk. There's virtually nothing there, so I have to be very careful when I plug things in to do any testing with this. But I did have to spend some time to try to repair that. And lastly, you might remember that I was going to put a acrylic blank inside of here. This is all in and epoxied. So this is all done and ready to go now. I'm going to probably take a couple of magnets and put them there so I can either mount my phone or the tablet that runs the engine management system, and will also connect to the transmission management system. As long as we're in the engine compartment, I cannot forget about the engine mounts, which I did complete, reassemble, and paint and install back in the truck. Now, I'll give you a nice time lapse of what I did here to get these up in there, but basically you've got to sneak up in through the front of the upper control arm mount to get the nuts on the back of those, which, yeah, challenging.
Oh, and while I was down there, I also put a new fuel filter in it.
And I did go up to Wapakoneta to Calvinator Engines and picked up the engine block and all the parts for the engine. So everything is here, ready to be assembled. And that's a good thing, because there are, as of today, officially 7 days to get all this together and running in the truck. And I cannot forget that I installed the throttle cable, and I've loosely installed it. I'll have to get the engine in there to find out where I need to trim this. This is a low-car throttle cable, and I've got to admit that the throttle cable that I used on the Ford was not nearly this good. I think the quality of these is quite good. I also got this from Summit. I'll link this down in the description, so if you're looking for throttle cables, I really like this one. Expensive too, but worth it, I think. I also went through this lighting wire loom that goes through the front and just redid all this, got rid of that plastic garbage. And this is a prelude to what you're going to see with the rest of the wiring harness that is now covered in zip ties, but this is how it'll look when I'm done with it.
That's a wrap on part 2 of the engine compartment and interior modifications on #ETCG Dad's Truck. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, there are links to the previous video and the video that comes after at the top of the description. So if you're trying to figure out where you are, or if you just want to figure out what's going on with ETCG Dad's Truck, links available to you, including one with the whole playlist if you want to sit down and grab some popcorn and watch the whole thing all the way through. I won't mind at all. Go for it. I will put links in the description to parts, tools, additional information, things like that that could help you with your truck if you have a similar truck. Other than that, if you have automotive questions, I ask that you head to EricTheCarGuy.com. That will be linked down in the description, along with all that other stuff that I mentioned. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I really appreciate it when you do that stuff. Be safe, have fun, stay dirty. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you next time.